Welcome to Saltaire, UNESCO World Heritage Site, situated in West Yorkshire, just a few miles down the road from Bradford. I'm in a beautiful location. Over here is the River Aire, then the Leeds-Liverpool Canal, and over here is the railway line. What a perfect place to build a mill. Join me on a journey back through time. I'm going to take you over the Victorian cobbles, tell you about Titus Salt, the man who built this remarkable village. He built one of the biggest mills in the world in the day, and it was built on the banks of the river and the canal in a beautiful Italian style. I'm also going to tell you about the royal connections, so join me. Jump on the time machine if you wish. We're going to rotate once anti-clockwise. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Welcome back to 1871. Titus Salt is still alive. He's still the big cheese over there at the Palace of Industry. But who was Titus Salt and why Saltaire? Follow me and all will be revealed. Titus was born in Morley in 1803, the son of Daniel and Grace Salt. According to the Reverend Balgani's biography of Salt in 1877, as a boy he was described as steady. The germs of a great future were hidden in him. Steadily he jogs along the Doncaster Road every day to school on his donkey, with his sister riding pillion behind. Who would have guessed then that this young boy on a donkey would become one of the country's richest men, go on to build an entire village, build the world's biggest mill, leaving a legacy that many thousands of people enjoy today. As a man, Titus was quiet, a man of few words, known as the silent man among strangers, but clearly had a very good business brain. He joined his father Daniel Salt in the family woolen business, moving to Bradford in 1822. Conditions there, though, for the poor were terrible. It was one of the most polluted cities in the country. Dirty, overcrowded slums, and Bradford Beck was contaminated with all kinds of waste, and that was used for drinking water by the poorest sections of society. Then, in 1848, cholera and typhoid arrived. It was also at this time that there was great social unrest. Bradford was described as being in a state of siege by a local journalist in the Bradford Observer. Salt was the main employer in Bradford at this time and was becoming increasingly worried about the health of his workers. Life expectancy was just 18. So he found this rural site and commissioned architects Lockwood and Mawson to build a village for him. So Titus Salt certainly wanted to put his name on the village, and he did just that, naming it Salt after himself and Aire after the River Aire, Saltaire. There are TS's all over the village. I'll show you some of them as we walk about. And all the streets are named after himself, his wife Caroline, and his 11 children. Oh, the royals get a mention too, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And Lockwood and Mawson, the architects who he commissioned to build the village, they get a street named after themselves as well. But Titus Salt never lived here in Saltaire. He rented a mansion, Crow Nest, in Lightcliffe, about 10 miles away from Anne Lister, she of Gentleman Jack fame. And behind me is the stable block and the carriage house where the horses were kept. But shall we go and have a look at the Palace of Industry? That's why we're here after all. Come follow me. Follow Polly. So the Grand Palace of Industry opened on the 20th of September 1853. The very same day Titus turned 50. Now he'd planned to retire on his 50th birthday. He was already a very wealthy man, thanks to his mills in Bradford. But rather than put his feet up, Titus Salt embarked on the biggest project of his life. The largest industrial building in the world at the time. 3,500 people worked in the mill, doing 10 and 12-hour shifts, producing 18 miles of cloth a week, which translates to about 5,000 miles a year. That's the same distance from Saltaire to Las Vegas in cloth. It had the largest unsupported roof in Europe, and it was virtually fireproof, made of stone and cast iron. If you take a look at these beautiful Italian twin towers, and if you happen to be in the Isle of Wight, or the next time in fact you go to the Isle of Wight, take a visit to Osborne House, the royal summer residence for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. See if you notice any resemblance. Titus copied these towers on the royal summer residence and put them on top of his mill. And to celebrate the grand opening, a Victorian banquet was organised. 3,200 diners all met in the combing shed that was decorated in flowers and flags and plants. There was even a plaster cast alpaca. I'll tell you more about the alpaca later on the tour. And I thought you might like to hear about the menu. 120 legs of mutton, 40 hams, 40 tongues, not very good for the vegetarians, 50 pigeon pies, 30 brace of grouse, 30 brace of partridge and 50 dishes of potted meat. And for the vegetarians, half a ton of potatoes. There was 2 tons of meat. And for dessert, 320 plum puddings, 100 dishes of tartlets and 100 jellies. And to wash all that down, there was champagne, but only 750 champagne glasses. So they were all equal there in this grand banquet in the combing shed, but some were more equal than others. Do you know, after all that, I'm starting to feel a bit peckish. I'm going to see if the dining room's open. Follow me. Follow Polly. Oh, it's closed. I think it closed in 1893. Hey ho. But behind me, through these doors, is the tunnel, which is still there today. And it was through this tunnel that the workers would walk from the mill along the cobbled road and they would emerge into the dining room. 600 workers would take breakfast in the dining room every morning. That would be porridge, a thin, watery gruel, served with a cup of hot milk for a penny. Lunch would be a plate of boiled beef for 2 pennies, or meat and potato pie for 2 pennies. And if you couldn't run to that, a bowl of soup for half a penny. A cup of tea was a penny. Relatively expensive back in the day. Let's go and take a closer look, shall we, at the dining room. Follow Polly. It took 20 years before the village was complete, and he built it in a very systematic way. First of all, the mill, and the second building was the dining room. 1854, the dining room opened, so he could feed his workers. He had to keep the workers fit and strong and well fed. And above the dining room, you can see the coat of arms, the Salt coat of arms, that strictly speaking, he invented for himself. So this building was also used as a schoolroom before the school was built. It was used as a public meeting hall and also for religious services before the church was built. Titus Salt was never afraid to experiment. In fact, it was one of his experiments that catapulted him, already a wealthy man, into one of the most wealthiest Victorians in the land. And that's all down to these beautiful creatures here, the alpacas of Peru. In the 1830s, Titus was in Liverpool in a warehouse near the docks. He came across some abandoned bales of wool. Nobody wanted this wool. Nobody knew what to do with this soft, long, lustrous fibre. Titus gathered the bales up, brought them back to his mill in Bradford and spent 18 months experimenting on it. He found a way to spin it into the most beautiful, soft, lustrous worsted. So good that he had a gown made up and he gave it to his friend Prince Albert. Told you with the royal connections. Albert then presented it to the Queen Victoria. She wore this gown of this beautiful worsted. Everybody wanted it. It became highly fashionable and in great demand. Titus now is one of the wealthiest men in the land. In 1871, there are 40 shops in Saltire, and all the shops were owned by the Salt estate. There's almost 4,500 people living in the village. It's quite a busy, bustling place. And here we are in front of number 11 Victoria Road, in front of a shop that the Charlesworths ran, which was a greengrocer's. Now, the Charlesworths were some of the main shopkeepers in the village. They also had a haberdasher's further down the road here, down Victoria Road. But I'm going to wander up the road now and let's see what we find. Follow Polly. Oh, I see some lions. Let me introduce you to war, peace, vigilance and determination. The 4 lions that have been guarding Saltire for nearly 150 years. But these lions weren't originally meant to be in Saltire. The lions were originally built to go at the foot of Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square in London, but they weren't big enough. So Titus found a way to get the lions here in Saltire. And they've been guarding the village for almost 150 years. So this is the school that Titus built for up to 750 pupils. Boys and girls were educated separately in 2 different buildings, up to the age of 12. Many of these pupils would have been part-timers, putting in shifts at the mill in and amongst their schooling. One pupil at the Salt Grammar School across the valley, but also in the Salt Mill estate, would go on to become famous on the London stage. Mary Studholme, that was her stage name, was a singer, and I'm going to tell you more about her in the next scene. I'm also going to show you the Toothill residence, and I may even tell you about my husband Sylvester's scandal, so tune in next time. So I think now would be a good time to tell you Pollie Toothill's story. Pollie was born plain old Mary Ackroyd in Bradford Moor. But I think Pollie must have been an aspirational young woman. She changed her name from Mary to Pollie, and then one day she meets Sylvester Toothill, an accountant of Saltire. And when she saw where the Toothills lived, only one of the grandest, the most elegant buildings in the village, the Saltire Club and Institute. She was fair swept off her feet, I can tell you. As grand as this building is, the Toothill residence was actually the basement flat behind me. Edward Toothill, my father-in-law Sylvester's father, is the curator of this grand building, and this was a grace and favour apartment. So as well as the Toothill's residence, the Saltire Club and Institute played host to a vast array of activities for the citizens of Saltire for their personal enjoyment and personal development. Salt was a great believer in self-help. Inside this beautiful building, there's an 800 capacity lecture theatre. There's a dance hall. There was music, there was billiards, there was bagatelle, there was a chess club, there was an art club. There was even a science laboratory in there, a gymnasium and a drill room. There were concerts in there, and who knows, maybe Mary Studholme performed there before she left Saltire for the London Lights and the New York Lights on Broadway. And now I would like to sing you a song from the time of Mary Studholme. She specialised in musical comedy, and this is a lovely comic song about an Italian maid and her misguided amore, Antonio. Oh, oh, Antonio. Oh, oh, Antonio, he's gone away, left me alone-io, all on my own-io. I want to meet him with his new sweetheart, and up will go Antonio and his ice cream cart. So as well as music in the Saltire Club and Institute, Titus Salt played host to a vast, impressive array of speakers. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, David Livingstone, the great explorer, and John Ruskin, the historian. Even Charles Dickens was invited to speak, but sadly he died. Oh, another character I ought to tell you about. Another Saltire character. Should I? Would you like to hear about my husband Sylvester's scandal? I thought you might. Follow Pollie. I need to go somewhere quiet to tell you. Follow Pollie. I'm going to take you somewhere quiet and I'm going to tell you. Is it all right here? Is there anybody around? No. Okay. It was reported in the local newspapers, the Leeds Mercury. My husband Sylvester Toothill was caught travelling in a railway carriage along the Midland Railway line from Leeds to Bradford via Appley Bridge. An inspector accosted him in the carriage and found him without a ticket. Oh, a serious crime back in the day. The Midland Railway were having problems with defrauding all the time. They took it seriously. They made a case out of Sylvester. He appeared in court. He was fined 40 shillings. 40 shillings! 2.5 weeks' salary, or a month in prison. Well, I'm glad to say that Sylvester narrowly missed going to jail, but he did bring shame on the Toothills. We would hang our heads in shame. The whole village was gossiping about this scandal. He did lead me a merry dance. Shortly after this, he disappeared. Turned up in Leicester. Don't know how he got there. Probably not on the train. Then he has a bright idea. Sets up with Mr. Baldwin of George Street. Baldwin and Toothill, worsted spinners of Wibsey. They only go in competition with the great man himself, don't they, Mr. Titus Salt? Bound to fail, and fail it did. It's reported in the newspapers shortly after that Baldwin and Toothill have gone bankrupt with debts of nearly £14,000. Again, a lot of money, a lot of money. Well, I think after hearing about my husband Sylvester's calamities, we'd better head up to the hospital. Follow Polly. Follow me. So health and safety in the Victorian times was not as it is today. In fact, there probably was little or no health and safety. And in the mills there were accidents. So Titus Salt built a hospital, opened it in 1868, just up the road from the mill, so that he could treat the patients as quickly as possible. I say he wasn't a doctor, although he did want to be a doctor, but that's another story. Samuel Rhines, a physician from Chelsea, was the surgeon, and he was assisted by matron Sarah Turner. She was a Nightingale-trained nurse and had met Florence Nightingale. There were 9 beds and 1 operating room, and the hospital worked as a hospital until 1979. And opposite, in Alexandra Square, where I'm sitting now, in this beautiful square filled with roses and weeping willows, are 45 almshouses. In the middle column, if you look carefully, you'll see a TS for Titus Salt and a CS for his wife Caroline. So I have a very sad story to tell you now about the occupants of number 19 Titus Street, the Dewhurst family. Poor Jimmy Dewhurst, 50-year-old, was working in the new dye house when his clothes got caught in the bevel wheels and he was swallowed up in the iron grip and died. Titus allowed his widow, Rhoda, 10 shillings per week until her youngest was 13 years old, and then 6 shillings per week, so long as she lived in the village. So quite a generous allowance from Titus. So we're now on George Street. All the houses in Saltire were built in terms of hierarchy, but they were occupied in terms of weekly income. The houses we can see here were built for the overlookers, and some of them, as you see, are slightly bigger than the others. So these may have been for the executive or the senior overlookers, so overlookers overlooking the overlookers. All the overlookers' houses benefited from a little garden in the front. They had 3 bedrooms and they had 4 panels, very importantly, in the doors. But every single house in Saltire benefited from 5 important features: clean running water, a good drainage system, open-ended streets where the lovely light and the air could flow freely. Every house had gas, and every house in Saltire had a backyard. And in the backyard was a midden, a privy, a toilet. Thanks to these benefits, life expectancy rose considerably. Just down the road in Bradford at the time, life expectancy was around 18 years of age. Here in Saltire, it rose to around 70. This grand house here is the second largest house in Saltire, 9 bedrooms, belonged to Colonel Thomas Henry Hill. He wasn't really a colonel, but he was in charge of the rules in Saltire, and there were many rules. Titus didn't want the police in Saltire. He had his own rules, and the colonel was in charge of implementing them. And if you look at the top of his house, you'll see what we think is a watchtower. He could look down and see all the streets in Saltire and see what the citizens of Saltire were getting up to. A question for you. Every single house in the village had one of these. Any ideas what it was used for? It's a boot scraper. So every house in Saltire has a boot scraper. Many of them have been filled in today, but back in the day, all the houses were owned by the Titus Salt mill estate, and they didn't want the residents going in their muddy boots. So this is the boot scraper. So now here we are at the bath and wash house. There were many rules in the village, as we know, and one of the rules regarding washing was no hanging out your washing in the streets. There's a wash house where you could bring your washing and have it washed, wrung and dried in an hour. There were all the latest industrial dryers, 6 washing machines, there was a rubbing tub and a boiling tub and air dryers. And for the humans, there were baths, 24, 12 for the men, 12 for the women. But they weren't cheap and they weren't popular because they weren't very private either. Hot bath had cost you 6p. And remember, you could have a meat and potato pie for your lunch for 2 pennies. And if you couldn't run to the 6p, how about a cold bath for 3 pennies? I don't think I'd fancy a cold bath in Saltire in January when those cold easterlies are blowing straight over from Siberia, it feels. But I'll tell you what they did have. Something that was very popular in many Victorian towns in the times. A Turkish bath, a steam bath. Now you're talking in January. So we're coming to the end of the tour, sadly, and Titus Salt ended his days at Crow Nest. He died in 1876, and there were over 100,000 people lining the roads for the funeral procession. He's buried in the family mausoleum back in the church where we started on the tour. Thank you very much for joining me. I do hope that you've enjoyed it, but it's time now to jump back on the time machine and move forward in time. Are you ready? After 3, we turn clockwise this time. 1, 2, 3. Welcome back to the 21st century. Saltire today is a very vibrant and popular village to visit by both locals and visitors from all over the world. It's thanks to local businessman Jonathan Silver that the mill is as it is today. Jonathan bought the mill and renovated it in the 1980s to reopen it in 1987 as the 1853 Gallery, which is now home to many of Jonathan Silver's good friends' artwork, the famous Bradford painter David Hockney. It's a wonderful place to visit. You can easily spend a full day here and not see everything. There are designer homeware outlets, art and literature books, art materials among the galleries and fabulous places to eat. I'd like to thank Saltire Festival for sponsoring this virtual tour. I'd also like to invite you to visit Saltire. Come and see this remarkable and intriguing village for yourself. Experience some of the lovely arts and community events that take place throughout the year, but especially come and visit Saltire Festival each September. Thank you very much for joining me and wish you well.